You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
When Jesus did the Lord's Supper, he replaced it because he says, I won't drink wine with you again until we do so the day that I come back. It was instituted by Christ while eating a Passover meal with his disciples in the night he was betrayed. So the deliverance achieved by Messiah at Armageddon will also be subject to memorial, worship, and praise. Isaiah's already alluded to all of that. But the word feast here is the word shag. It's usually used talking about the Feast of Tabernacles.
As Pastor Ken continues his teaching series through the book of Isaiah, he'll be reminding you that the Lord's second coming could be at any time. All the prophecies concerning his first coming have been fulfilled. And now there are no more prophecies that must be fulfilled for him to come for his church. In his first coming, Jesus fulfilled the role of Israel's deliverer and king. In his second coming, Israel and the whole world will mourn for not having accepted the Messiah the first time he came. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Isaiah, chapter 30, as he continues his message, The End is Near.
Matthew 13, he talks about a story of weeds in the field, and he talks about the Son of Man as the farmer who plants good seed. The field is the world. The good seed represents the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The enemy plants the weeds among the wheat is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the world. The harvesters are the angels, and the weeds are sorted out and burned in the fire. In other words, the sieve again is being used. But here he's talking about it being used as a form of judgment. Well, that's what Jesus is talking about as well, the same thing. He's talking about it as a form of judgment. Yahweh is going to destroy his enemies just like someone sifting worthless material from good material and destroying the worthless part. I mean, when they get done sifting through the wheat, and they have good wheat, and they'll put it in a pile over here, here's the chaff. This is if the wind's blowing that way. If it's blowing that way, it's over here because it's lighter than wheat. You got the sand at your feet, you've got the wheat right here in the sieve, you put it in that stack, and this pile over here you burn because it's worthless. It's just chaff. You don't want that. This verse also has scope in it that expands this beyond Assyria. Notice that he uses the word nations. This is a theme that begins back in Genesis chapter 11. It goes on into Deuteronomy 32. The nations are those people who have not been reconciled to the king by the time we come to the end of the age. We have earth dwellers, the nations, those who think their future is here on planet Earth. They're the ones who are going to be compelled to come and attack Jerusalem at the end of the age. There's that bridle. They're going to be forced to do something they don't want to do, but they're going to do it. Zechariah talks about it in chapter 14. From the Septuagint, he says, I will gather together all nations against Jerusalem for war. The city will be conquered, and the houses will be snatched away, and the women will be defiled, and half the city will go into captivity. But the rest of my people will not be utterly destroyed from the city, and the Lord will go out and set up an army against those nations, just like the day of his arrangement in a day of war. What the nations have in store for them when the Lamb shows up, what they have in store is the wrath of the Lamb. This wrath, this judgment being described here in Isaiah is an example of what it is the angel of the Lord does to the Assyrian army camped around Jerusalem. But at the end of the age, this is what he's going to do with the word of his mouth. This is what Jesus does to the army that's camped around Jerusalem at the end of the age. That's in Zechariah 14. This will be the nature of the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that have fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will decay while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot away in their sockets, and their tongues will dissolve in their mouths. On that day there will be great confusion from the Lord among them, and they'll seize each other and attack one another violently. And all Jesus says is one word. He holds everything together through his power, and I don't know if he just says, those of you attacking, I'm not holding you together anymore. And they just start falling apart. I don't know exactly what it is he's going to say, but that's what's going to happen. I find it very interesting that the terminology used is the same that's used as people who suffer from the exposure to high amounts of radiation as a result of nuclear weaponry. Just interesting stuff when you start looking at it. But it comes quickly. That's the whole sense of what's being said here. It's swift, it's forceful. He breathes out nothing but fire of divine wrath. There's no standing. The Assyrian army can't stand. They just can't. In a moment, they're carried away with this force. The Lord will literally consume, and the Lord will do the same at the end of the age. He'll literally consume the man of sin and his armies with the spirit or breath of his mouth and destroy him. That's what's going to happen. But in the near term, stop and think about this. The Assyrian army comes to Jerusalem to take spoil. We're going to take all your stuff away from you, King Hezekiah, and kill you. And what happens? Overnight, they're done. The Lord takes care of them. And of course, Israel then spends all their time taking stuff away from their bodies and all the stuff that they left, and then they go and burn them. This is also what's going to happen at the end of the age. The exact same thing. So verse 28, his breath like a raging torrent reaching halfway up the neck. It's a view of water just rising to the point where it's right here. To set a misguiding yoke upon nations, as it says in the Tanakh, and a misleading bridle upon the jaws of the people. So what you see is that picture of them being forced to go someplace they don't want to go and being judged at that point. This is an idea of driving those to the place where they're going to be judged. That's in Ezekiel too. Ezekiel talks about it when he talks about the Gog-Magog war in chapter 38, verses 1 to 6. When you focus in, he says, I'm going to turn you around and put hooks in your jaws and bring you out, you and your whole army. That sounds like they're being forced to do something they don't want to do, doesn't it? But that's the language that is used there in Ezekiel. So this is consistent with what the Lord's going to do at the end of the age. They don't want to come back to Jerusalem. They don't want to fight because Babylon's about to be destroyed, the world's falling apart, and they know there's something else going on. Verse 29, so we've talked about this theophany. Here's the view of the judgment taking place. So while the judgment is taking place, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, you will have songs as in the night when you keep the festival, and gladness of heart as when one marches to the sound of the flute to go to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. So while they're dying, you're rejoicing. That's the picture here. Because of the salvation of Jerusalem, there's going to be songs, there's going to be praise. I mean, this is compared to Passover, the festival. That's what he's talking about. Just as the Lord protected his people overnight in Egypt, and then it's because of that, when they have Passover, they sing Hallel psalms. They worship and praise because the Egyptians aren't worshiping and praising, but his people are. The same thing will happen when the angel of the Lord deals with the Assyrians overnight, and when Messiah deals with the armies of the Assyrian at the end of the age. I would not be surprised that we start having Passover and the songs talk about God's glory when he brings them out of Egypt, but we also start singing about God's glory when he saves them from the beast. I think that's going to be part of it. There are some Jewish teachers who actually also teach that the night actually, when the army of the Assyrians were destroyed by Yahweh, was Passover. Now, the text doesn't say that. It just doesn't. But if you want to read it, I've included for you to look at some sections from the Jerusalem Talmud that do talk to that. I mean, very specifically, where they talk about, well, you're going to have the worship music and you're going to sing the Hallel Psalms and so forth because of Sennacherib being destroyed, and they imply that it's also on Passover. We don't know for sure. The text does not say that. It's a common notion that they have. We do know it happened at night, okay? We don't know if it was Passover. But it was at night. We know that. Praise and singing will take place among those of his people who are saved. And this praise and worship continues on into the future as a remembrance on Passover, and it's a remembrance of the blood that was applied up to the door and to the two sides of the door, and it'll be also remembered after Jesus returns as to what he did on the cross, and the blood being applied again, because Jesus is the ultimate Passover. He replaced it, in fact. The Passover meal was a memorial but it was also a sacrifice meal where you would eat the lambs which had been offered to make atonement for the forgiveness of sins. When Jesus did the Lord's Supper, he replaced it because he says, I won't drink wine with you again until we do so the day that I come back. It was instituted by Christ while eating a Passover meal with his disciples on the night he was betrayed. So the deliverance achieved by Messiah at Armageddon will also be subject to memorial, worship, and praise. Isaiah's already alluded to all of that. But the word feast here is the word shag. It's usually used talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'm probably mispronouncing it. But it's an unmistakable allusion, though, here to Passover, because it happens at night. We see the festival at night. It means the night before the Passover, which was a festival night. It preceded and introduced the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this Passover night idea has been taken and is being used by Isaiah here. So literally, those who are being judged by the Lord will experience his burning anger, his indignation, his judgment. But meanwhile, in Jerusalem, they're going to be worshiping and praising while that's going on. Verse 30, the Lord will cause his voice of authority to be heard, and the descending of his arm to be seen in fierce anger, and in the flame of a consuming fire in cloudburst, downpour, and hailstones. Now, stop and remember, the Assyrians have not listened to the voice of the Lord since some guy named Jonah walked through Nineveh and said, 30 days and you're toast. Okay? And they repented from that. But they've not heard a word from God since then. And they've definitely not repented. They were used by Yahweh to judge the northern kingdom. Isaiah talks about that. But Isaiah also talks about the fact that they went beyond what they were supposed to do. It's kind of like, I want you to do this, take their house away from them. Well, they burned the house to the ground. That was more than they were supposed to do. So they're going to hear his voice of authority on the hills of Judea. Now, at the end of the age, we're also told that it is his voice, his word, that it will cause the demise of the army of the beast, or the army of the Assyrian. Because notice again, back in Revelation 19, he has a sword in his mouth. In other words, it's his word that is going to cause the destruction of the enemy. He comes with this huge army behind him, but he does it all himself with just his word. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He'll rule them with a rod of iron. He'll tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God, the Almighty. But it's his word, just as Isaiah is saying, it's his word that's going to be used to judge the nations and to judge Assyria. The Lord is acting according to his word, his voice. And you see a reference to his arm, not arms, arm. A Jewish reader would immediately remember when they see the anthropomorphic things that are referenced here, because numerous times in the scriptures, God is described in human terms so that people can understand. That's called making him more human-like. It's an anthropomorphic discussion about who he is. And you see his hand referenced. You see his fingers referenced. In fact, it says that his fingers, he pushed the stars out to where they are with his fingers. It also talks about him saving with his hand, but it was with his arm he allowed the nation of Israel to go across the Red Sea. Well, we'll see that arm being used in judgment here. The reader is going to know that we're talking about Deuteronomy 4, we're talking about Deuteronomy 5, 7, 11, 2, but then we see this also in Jeremiah. Jeremiah says in 32:17 that God made the heavens and the earth with his arms, both of them. But how much does he have to take care of Assyria? One descending arm. How much is he going to have to use to take care of the Assyrian and his armies at the end of the age? One descending arm. In other words, he doesn't have to put all of his effort into it, is what he's saying. He did more to create the world than he is to judging those who need to be judged. Last half of verse 30, in the flame of a consuming fire, in cloudburst, downpour, and hailstones. Y'all remember what one of the plagues were in Egypt? It was hailstones and fire and downpour all at once. Well, that's what they're going to think. When they read this, they're going, oh yeah, Exodus chapter 9. We got that. When Moses extended his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder, hail, and fire fell to the earth. Now, it didn't fall on everybody, just on the Egyptians. The land of Goshen, where the nation of Israel was, were kept apart from that. But the hail was so severe there had not been any like it in the land of Egypt since, or it had become a nation. This also shows up in the trumpet judgment too, in Revelation 8. This is the first trumpet judgment in verse 7. The first sounded, there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown to earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. There you see that picture again of judgment. It's the same picture, hail and fire being mixed together. Now, part of the theme is hail. It shows up multiple times in the Bible. It's a form of judgment, and it's usually tied to judgment on those who have blasphemed the Lord. Now, the penalty, according to the Old Testament for blasphemy, is stoning. And I find it interesting that every time you start reading about people who have blasphemed the Lord, there's a hailstorm with big hailstones. I don't know if you've ever seen a hailstorm bigger than what we get here in Florida, which is, little pea-sized stuff. But I've seen hailstones as big as grapefruit and the damage that it causes. I worked with a gentleman who was getting out of his car and hail was falling the size of baseballs. And one hit him in the head, and he wound up having to have surgery to remove a subdural hematoma that he sustained as a result of getting hit in the head. I mean, this stuff can kill you, but what we're talking about here is even worse. And as we found in the book of Judges, or book of Joshua, it's amazing how it only hits those who are the enemy and it doesn't hit the Jews at all. God's really good at aiming it. But the term blasphemy normally means, it just means verbal slander against God or acts of slander against God. Those are all things that are blasphemy. So Sennacherib blasphemes Yahweh. Rabshakeh, that's a title, that's one of his officials. He also blasphemes God. The penalty for blasphemy is stoning. That carries on throughout the tribulation as well. As we examine the New Testament, we see Jesus telling the Pharisees, who had just attributed his work through the power of the Holy Spirit to Satan, he says, for this reason I tell you, people will be forgiven for every sin and blasphemy, but blasphemy against the Spirit will not be forgiven. So in Revelation 16, we see the torrent being poured out as being predicted here in Isaiah. And towards the end of verse 20 and 21, it says, and huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men. And were they happy about it? No. It says men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague was extremely severe. They were blaspheming the Lord to begin with, rolling into this, and the judgment doesn't make them change and repent. It makes them worse. So we come back to verse 31 here of chapter 30. For at the voice of the Lord, Assyria will be terrified when he strikes with the rod. I mean, they will suddenly realize who the God of the universe really is. And every blow of the rod of punishment which the Lord will lay on him will be with the music of tambourines and lyres. And in battles, brandishing weapons, he will fight them. Now, Sennacherib's own court records have been recovered. We know what he boasts of what he did to Jerusalem, okay? And it's what he doesn't say, which is interesting. He boasts about taking 200,000 Jewish prisoners, and we know that the surrounding villages around Jerusalem were captured and many taken away into exile. He also says he shut Hezekiah up in his city like a bird in a cage. That's actually in the language of the Assyrians there. But he never claims to have taken Jerusalem captive, because he didn't. And he kind of spins everything on the documents to make it sound like it's good, what I did was good, instead of what really happened. The records are silent about him losing a good chunk of his army. But conquerors don't boast about that stuff. They never talk about their defeats. And the Greek historian Herodotus, not a believer, reports that he did sustain massive losses, but because it was field mice who ate the army's weapons and left them exposed to destruction by some unnamed enemy. Now, if you believe that, I got a bridge for sale in Brooklyn. Real cheap. But this was actually written by a Greek historian. And it is kind of also a narrative being pushed by Sennacherib himself. Now, Josephus, who was a Jew and a historian, he was a turncoat, but he's still Jewish. He attributes it to all being done by God. Now, the Assyrian ruler does say that they moved on Jerusalem. And he does talk about taking money from Jerusalem, but he twists it all around. Now, remember, he threatens to attack Jerusalem. Hezekiah will give money to make him go away, and he takes the money and attacks anyhow. Nice guy. But Sennacherib will twist it around saying, well, I extracted this money from him. But he doesn't say, he never says he took Jerusalem. He never says he fought a battle. He doesn't say he won, which is really weird because he goes out of his way to say he won battles all over the place. But he doesn't say anything about Jerusalem. Instead, he tries to explain away why Hezekiah, who rebelled, is still alive and still king of Jerusalem. He tries to explain that. The picture provided in verse 29 and 30 shows that there's a dramatic difference between those who rely on God and those who do not rely on God. His people are rejoicing and singing, while at the same time judgment is falling upon those who don't follow God. For many today, you look at this and that's kind of disturbing. You say, wow, worshiping the Lord while other people are being judged? This is not new. It's not a new picture. Verse 31 tells us praise takes place while judgment's taking place. This happened with a guy named King Jehoshaphat earlier in the history of Jerusalem. At that point, they were being invaded by Ammon, Moab, and Edom. In other words, modern-day Jordan was attacking. They pray, God responds. God says, mobilize. They do, to sing worship music while the enemy is dealt with by God. So we see in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, all of the result of the prayer, they receive a word from the Lord through a prophet. He says, hear all Judah, the ones who dwell in Jerusalem, and King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Lord to you, do not fear them or be scared from the face of this large crowd, because the line for battle is not for you, but rather it is for God. Tomorrow, go down upon them. Look, they're going up according to the ascent of Ziz. You'll find them upon the pinnacle of the river in the desert of Jeruel. It's not for you to make war. Take note of these things and observe the deliverance of the Lord. I find it interesting that the Lord gives them military intelligence, where they are, where they're going to come up, what they're going to do, and how they're going to do it. So we do know that God had listening devices all over the Middle East at this point. The folks in Damascus complained about the same thing. They said that Elisha knew exactly what the king was doing in his bedroom and told it to the king of Israel. So, can't hide anything from the Lord, that's for sure. But we see here in Isaiah, in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 20 to 22, they rise up in the morning, they go out into the desert, and he stops and says, hear me, Judah, and the ones who dwell in Jerusalem, trust in the Lord.
Because you decided to stay tuned, you've just been a part of the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown. Do you know how glad it makes our hearts to know you're investing time in your relationship with Jesus? So much. In fact, would you connect with us and share a little about what's been happening in your life and how this radio ministry has affected you? The unsafebible.com has a space for you to do just that. Go to the Connect tab at the side and then click on the Connect card. Once there, fill out the form, and then we'll be sure to touch base with you. Pastor Ken's message from Isaiah today left me reflecting on my own life and how I treat people. Do I treat them how I want to be treated? Do I give them the cold shoulder when I feel like it? Or do I choose kindness over retaliation? Isaiah was one of the major prophets that confronted some of these common issues we still face today. You don't want to miss any of these teachings. Trust me. If you already have, don't sweat it. We have your bases covered. Just go to the unsafebible.com and click on Media. There you'll find this and other messages to listen to. If Go 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 is your middle name and you can't seem to find a still moment, you can follow us via Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We'd also like to personally invite you to attend one of our services. Find all the information you need, including directions, at our website. And just in case you've forgotten, it's the unsafebible.com. We hope to meet you soon. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Come back again for more of the Unsafe Bible.